April 1945. A German officer staggers into Hitler's bunker with news so catastrophic, so utterly humiliating, that the Führer's hands begin to shake uncontrollably. Mein Führer, the Ruhr. It's gone. All of it. 300,000 men. Captured. In 18 days. Hitler's response? He ordered the execution of the messenger. Not because the man lied, but because the truth was simply too devastating to accept. You see, what Patton pulled off in the Ruhr Pocket wasn't just a military victory. It was the single largest mass surrender of German troops in the entire war. Bigger than Stalingrad. Bigger than Tunisia. Bigger than anything the Wehrmacht had ever experienced. And when the German High Command realized what had happened, their reaction revealed something the history books rarely talk about: the complete psychological collapse of Nazi Germany's military elite. Let me show you exactly what happened. To understand why the Ruhr Pocket broke the German High Command's spirit, you need to understand what the Ruhr actually meant to Nazi Germany. Imagine if someone captured every single factory in China, every power plant in Texas, and every steel mill in Pennsylvania, all at once. That's what the Ruhr was to Germany. It was the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The furnaces that forged Tiger tanks. The factories that assembled Messerschmitt fighters. The coal mines that powered the entire German war machine. Hitler had been crystal clear about this. Whoever holds the Ruhr, holds Germany. Whoever loses the Ruhr, loses the war. So naturally, he packed it with the best troops he had left. Army Group B, commanded by one of Germany's most ruthless field marshals, Walter Model. Now Model wasn't your typical Nazi general. He was Hitler's personal favorite troubleshooter. Whenever a front was collapsing, Hitler sent Model to fix it. The man had earned the nickname, the Führer's fireman, because he kept putting out military fires all across Europe. The Model had stopped the Soviet offensive at Rzhev. He'd stabilized the Eastern Front after Stalingrad. He delayed the Allied advance in the Netherlands. The guy was basically Germany's last competent field commander. And Hitler gave him 325,000 men, 30 divisions, and one simple order: hold the Ruhr at all costs. What Hitler didn't anticipate was George S. Patton. While the rest of the Allied commanders were playing it safe, moving methodically across Germany, Patton was doing what Patton always did, ignoring orders and moving at insane speed. His Third Army had already crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim before the famous Remagen Bridge crossing even happened. While Montgomery was still planning his carefully coordinated offensive, Patton's tanks were already 50 miles into German territory. But here's where it gets interesting. Patton looked at the map and saw something beautiful. The Ruhr industrial region sat in a massive valley. If American forces from the north and south could link up behind it, they'd trap the entire German Army Group B in a giant pocket. The plan was audacious. Some said suicidal. The distance between the northern and southern American forces was over 200 miles. German units were scattered throughout the area. The terrain was brutal. And the Model had 325,000 desperate soldiers who knew this was their last stand. General Omar Bradley, Patton's superior, had concerns. Eisenhower had doubts. The British thought it was madness. Patton's response? I'm not going to drive around the Ruhr. I'm going to cut it off like a diseased limb and watch it rot. Classic Patton. On March 25, 1945, he launched the operation. His tanks didn't just advance, they sprinted 80 miles in the first 3 days. Villages fell so fast that German commanders couldn't even report their positions before American Sherman tanks rolled through the town square. Meanwhile, from the north, the Ninth Army under General William Simpson was doing the same thing. Two American pincers, racing toward each other at unprecedented speed. Field Marshal Model was not a stupid man. He realized what was happening within the first 48 hours. American forces weren't trying to push through the Ruhr, they were trying to surround it. He immediately requested permission to withdraw his forces before the trap closed. His message to the German High Command was urgent: request immediate authorization for breakout. American forces are converging rapidly. Encirclement imminent within days. The response from Hitler's headquarters? Permission denied. The Ruhr will be defended to the last man. No retreat. No surrender. Victory or death. Model sent another message. More desperate this time. Without immediate withdrawal, Army Group B faces total annihilation. 325,000 men will be lost. This is not tactical pessimism, this is mathematical certainty. Hitler's answer arrived the same day: hold your positions. Reinforcements are coming. The enemy's supply lines are overextended. They will collapse. The reinforcements, of course, were a fantasy. Germany had nothing left to send. And here's the tragic part. The model knew it. He'd served on the Eastern Front. He'd seen what happened to armies that got encircled. He'd watched the 6th Army die at Stalingrad because Hitler refused to let them retreat. Now he was watching it happen to his own men. April 1, 1945. Easter Sunday. At 4 p.m., American forces from the 1st and 9th Armies linked up at the town of Lippstadt. The Ruhr Pocket was officially sealed. Inside that pocket, 325,000 German soldiers. 30 divisions. 1 field marshal. And 0 escape routes. When the news reached the German High Command, there was stunned silence. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff, just stared at the map for several minutes without speaking. Finally, he muttered, "This is the end." Not the beginning of the end. The end. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the German Armed Forces High Command, had a more colorful reaction. According to witnesses, he swept the situation maps off the table and screamed, "Impossible. The Americans cannot move that fast. This is Allied propaganda." It wasn't propaganda. It was Patton. But Hitler's reaction was the most chilling. When told that 325,000 of his soldiers were now trapped with no hope of rescue, he simply said, "Then they must fight and die where they stand." Every German soldier in the Ruhr is a fortress unto himself. Easy to say when you're hiding in a bunker in Berlin. Inside the Ruhr Pocket, Model faced an impossible situation. His 325,000 men were scattered across 4,000 square miles of industrial wasteland. They had fuel for about 3 days of operations. Food for maybe a week. Ammunition was running dangerously low. And American forces were squeezing the pocket smaller every single day. The model tried to organize a defense, but it was like trying to hold water in a sieve. His communications were shattered. His units were isolated. American fighter bombers controlled the skies, destroying any convoy that dared move during daylight. Young German soldiers, some as young as 15, started surrendering in droves. Whole units threw down their weapons the moment American tanks appeared. Years of Nazi propaganda about fighting to the last man evaporated in the face of reality. Model's own officers began questioning whether continued resistance had any point. One divisional commander reportedly told Model, "Field Marshal, we can either die for nothing or live for something. Our families need us. Germany will need us to rebuild." The Model's response revealed his internal torment. He said, "I know this. But I swore an oath." "What would you have me do, become a traitor?" The oath he referenced was personal. Unlike most German officers who swore loyalty to Germany, officers in the Nazi era swore a direct oath to Adolf Hitler himself. And Model, for all his tactical brilliance, couldn't bring himself to break that oath. At least not yet. Back in Berlin, the reality of the Ruhr catastrophe was setting in. And it was breaking something fundamental in the German military leadership. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, had already been dismissed for telling Hitler the truth about Germany's hopeless situation. Now, other generals were watching Army Group B die in slow motion. General Hans Krebs, who would soon become the last chief of German General Staff, sent a secret assessment to other senior officers. His words were devastating. The Ruhr encirclement represents not merely a tactical setback but the psychological death of the German army. When 325,000 soldiers surrender to an enemy we called inferior, what remains of our fighting spirit. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had replaced the legendary von Rundstedt as Commander-in-Chief West, tried to organize a relief operation. He drew up plans, moved units on paper, and submitted optimistic reports to Hitler. But privately, Kesselring told his staff, "There is no relief operation. There are no reserves. We are writing fiction for a madman in a bunker." The German High Command was now operating in two realities. The official reality, where brave German soldiers would turn the tide any day now. And the actual reality, where everyone knew the war was lost and was just trying to survive until the surrender. As the pocket shrank, Model made one last attempt to salvage something from the disaster. On April 15, he issued an order that shocked everyone, including himself. He dissolved Army Group B. Not surrendered. Dissolved. There's a difference, and it matters. A surrender would mean Model personally handing over his command to the Americans. That would violate his oath to Hitler. That, in the Model's mind, would make him a traitor. But dissolving the unit? That was a technicality. He wasn't surrendering his army, he was simply declaring that the army no longer existed. Individual soldiers were now free to do as they pleased. They could try to escape. They could surrender on their own. They could even keep fighting as guerrillas. The Model was releasing his men from their oaths without releasing himself from his. The order read, Army Group B is hereby dissolved. Any soldier who can make his way home to care for his family should do so. Any soldier who chooses to surrender may do so without dishonor. I will not lead you into captivity. God protect Germany. Within 48 hours, 317,000 German soldiers had surrendered. It was the single largest mass surrender in European history. More than Stalingrad. More than Tunisia. More than anything the world had ever seen. When confirmed reports of the mass surrender reached German High Command, the reactions revealed more about the psychological state of Nazi Germany's leadership than any battle could. General Jodl dictated a memo that was supposed to be an official assessment but reads more like a mental breakdown on paper. The capitulation of Army Group B represents the final collapse of Western defense capability. The enemy now possesses unrestricted access to the German heartland. All previous strategic calculations are void. Recommend immediate consideration of, and here the memo just stops. Jodl apparently couldn't bring himself to write the word, surrender. Field Marshal Keitel issued an order declaring that any German soldier who had surrendered in the Ruhr was now a deserter and would be shot if recaptured. The order was both psychotic and irrelevant. Germany would be completely conquered within 3 weeks anyway. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, wrote in his diary, with the Ruhr gone, there is no more war production. Germany is now fighting with the weapons we have already built and nothing more. Every bullet fired is irreplaceable. Every tank destroyed is gone forever. Patton didn't just capture men, he captured our future. General Gotthard Heinrichi, who was desperately trying to defend Berlin from the approaching Soviets, was asked for his reaction to the Ruhr collapse. His response was darkly practical, perhaps it is better that 300,000 Germans are in American hands than Soviet hands. The Americans will treat them as prisoners. The Soviets would treat them as slaves, or corpses. But the most revealing reaction came from Hitler himself. When Hitler was informed that over 300,000 of his soldiers had surrendered, not died fighting, but surrendered, he flew into one of his infamous rages. According to witnesses in the bunker, Hitler screamed for nearly an hour about traitors and cowards. He demanded that Model be arrested and court-martialed. He ordered that the families of any officer who surrendered should be punished. Then, suddenly, he went quiet. After several minutes of silence, Hitler said something that revealed his complete break from reality. They have surrendered because they were not true National Socialists. A real German, a true believer, would have fought to the death. The Ruhr soldiers were infected by defeatism. This is not a military failure, it is a moral failure. In Hitler's twisted worldview, the problem wasn't that he'd ordered 325,000 men to defend an impossible position. The problem was that those men weren't fanatical enough to die pointlessly. But the generals around him knew the truth. Model's Army Group B wasn't filled with cowards. It was filled with ordinary soldiers who realized that dying for a lost cause wasn't heroism, it was stupidity. On April 21, 1945, the Ruhr Pocket finally collapsed completely. American forces had reduced the encircled area to nothing. There was nowhere left to hide. Model spent his final hours walking through the Ruhr forests with his aide-de-camp. According to testimony given after the war, Model discussed his options openly. He could surrender. The Americans would certainly accept it. But Model knew that the Soviets wanted him for war crimes committed on the Eastern Front. If he became an American prisoner, he might eventually be handed over to the Russians. And Soviet justice for German field marshals was final. He could try to escape. But to where? Germany was being overrun from all sides. There was no safe haven left. Or he could end things on his own terms. Model reportedly said, "A German field marshal does not surrender. That has never happened, and it will not happen now." His aide reminded him that Field Marshal Paulus had surrendered at Stalingrad. Model's response was bitter, "And Paulus is now a Soviet propaganda tool. He betrayed everything we fought for. I will not become a Soviet exhibit or an American trophy." At approximately 3 p.m. on April 21, 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model walked into a dense forest near the town of Rattingen. He put his pistol to his head. The Führer's fireman had extinguished himself. Here's what the history books often miss about the Ruhr Pocket: it wasn't just a battle. It was the moment Nazi Germany's military mythology died. For years, German propaganda had painted the Wehrmacht as invincible warriors who would never surrender. Stalingrad had cracked that myth. The Ruhr shattered it completely. When 317,000 soldiers, many of them veterans, many of them true believers in the Nazi cause, chose captivity over death, it proved something profound. Even the most fanatical ideology cannot overcome the human will to survive. And the German High Command knew it. After the Ruhr surrender, there were no more serious attempts to rally the German military. The remaining generals spent their final days trying to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. The war effort became a scramble for personal survival, not national victory. General Jodl, who would later sign Germany's unconditional surrender, admitted in post-war interrogations, "After the Ruhr, we knew there was no possibility of organized resistance. We continued fighting only to allow German civilians to flee west, away from the Soviet advance." The war, as a war, ended in that pocket. And what about the man who made it all happen? George S. Patton, never a man of false modesty, had plenty to say about his triumph. When told that 317,000 Germans had surrendered, Patton replied, 300,000. I thought it would be more. My men must have been moving too slowly. Classic Patton. But in his diary, Patton was more reflective. The capture of the Ruhr Pocket is the greatest tactical achievement of this war. We have destroyed an entire German army group without a major battle. This is not just victory, this is perfection. Patton understood something that many commanders missed. The purpose of war isn't to kill the enemy. It's to break their will to fight. And by moving faster than anyone thought possible, Patton had trapped an entire army before they could even organize a defense. The result? Minimal American casualties. Maximum German surrender. Textbook perfection. Eisenhower sent Patton a personal message after the Ruhr victory: "Your audacity has shortened this war by months. The American people owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Coming from Eisenhower, who often clashed with Patton's aggressive methods, this was high praise indeed. But behind the numbers and the military glory was a profound human tragedy. 317,000 German soldiers became American prisoners. Many of them were teenagers, drafted in the final desperate months of the war. Many were old men, veterans of World War I who had been pulled back into service. Many were fathers who would never see their children again. The American forces were not prepared for this many prisoners. Temporary camps were set up in open fields. Food and water were scarce. Medical care was limited. Conditions in these Rheinwiesenlager, Rhine meadow camps, were brutal. Thousands of German prisoners died from exposure, disease, and malnutrition in the months following the surrender. The exact numbers are still debated by historians, but estimates range from several thousand to potentially tens of thousands. This isn't to equate American prisoner camps with Nazi death camps. There is no moral equivalence. But it's important to acknowledge that the Ruhr Pocket's aftermath involved suffering that statistics alone don't capture. For the German soldiers who survived, captivity lasted anywhere from months to years. Some weren't released until 1948. They returned to a Germany that had been completely destroyed and divided. So what do we actually learn from the Ruhr Pocket? First, speed kills armies. Not bullets, not bombs, speed. Patton's Third Army moved so fast that the Germans couldn't react. By the time Model understood what was happening, the trap had already closed. In modern military doctrine, this is called getting inside the enemy's decision loop. Patton didn't invent it, but he perfected it. Second, ideology breaks against reality. Nazi Germany had built an entire worldview around the idea of German military superiority. But when 300,000 soldiers faced the choice between pointless death and survival, most chose survival. Propaganda can motivate people to start fighting. It cannot force them to die when all hope is gone. Third, leadership matters at every level. The Model was one of Germany's most capable commanders. But he was trapped by an oath to a madman and a strategic situation he couldn't escape. His decision to dissolve the army rather than formally surrender saved thousands of lives, but his personal code prevented him from saving himself. Finally, war is not a video game. Real people make real choices with real consequences. The German High Command's reaction to the Ruhr catastrophe wasn't just a strategic calculation, it was a psychological breakdown. Men who had spent their entire careers building the German military watched it disintegrate in 18 days. The German High Command's response to the Ruhr Pocket reveals something crucial about how Nazi Germany's leadership operated in its final months. They were living in a fantasy. Even as 317,000 soldiers were marching into captivity, Hitler was ranting about secret weapons that would turn the tide. Goebbels was broadcasting about the inevitable victory that was just around the corner. Generals were moving non-existent divisions on situation maps. The Ruhr defeat should have ended the war immediately. Any rational leadership would have surrendered on the spot. Germany had lost its industrial heartland. Its largest remaining army group had been destroyed. There was nothing left to fight with. But Nazi Germany wasn't rational. It was ideological. An ideology, especially apocalyptic ideology, doesn't respond to military defeats the way normal governments do. Instead of surrendering, Nazi leadership doubled down. Teenage boys were drafted into combat units. Old men were given anti-tank weapons and told to stop Sherman tanks. Civilians were ordered to fight to the death for streets that had already been reduced to rubble. The result was an additional 3 weeks of pointless bloodshed. Thousands more Germans died. Thousands more Allied soldiers died. All because Hitler and his inner circle refused to accept what the Ruhr Pocket had made obvious: the war was over. For the American soldiers who captured the Ruhr Pocket, the experience was surreal. They had been told that Germans would fight fanatically, that every city would be defended block by block, that the war would drag on for months. Instead, they found entire German units waiting to surrender. Soldiers who hadn't eaten in days. Teenagers crying for their mothers. Officers who handed over their weapons with relief rather than shame. Private First Class James Murphy of the 3rd Armored Division described it this way. "We rolled into this town expecting a fight. Instead, there's about 2,000 Germans sitting in the town square with their hands up. Their commanding officer walks up to our tank and says, in perfect English, 'Thank God you Americans and not Russians. Please accept our surrender.' I didn't know what to say. I just gave him a cigarette." For many American soldiers, the Ruhr Pocket was the first time they truly understood that Germany had lost. Not losing, had already lost. The capture of 317,000 prisoners in less than 3 weeks made it undeniable. So when you ask what the German High Command said when Patton captured 300,000 men in the Ruhr Pocket, the answer is more complicated than any single quote. Some panicked. Some denied reality. Some quietly began planning their own surrenders. Hitler screamed about traitors. The model walked into a forest and never came out. And 317,000 German soldiers became the living proof that the Third Reich was finished. Patton did what Patton always did: he moved faster, hit harder, and fought bigger than anyone expected. The Ruhr Pocket wasn't just a victory. It was a masterpiece of military strategy that broke the German army's will to fight. The German High Command's reaction? They couldn't even agree on what to say. Because there are no words for watching your life's work, your country's military, and your ideology collapse in 18 days. And that, in a way, tells you everything you need to know. Now you understand why the Ruhr Pocket was the moment World War II in Europe truly ended, even though the paperwork took another 3 weeks. Pretty wild, right? If you want to know what happened when the Soviets reached Berlin and finally ended Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, spoiler, it lasted 12 years, that story is waiting for you right here. Or drop a comment below and tell me, if you were a model, trapped in that pocket with 300,000 men and no hope of escape, what would you have done? I'll see you in the next one.